Post week 0 playoff predictions. Isn't this so beautiful? Only 4 games were played in week 0, and my playoff bracket has already changed because I had Florida State winning the ACC, going undefeated 13-0. You can laugh all you want. It's totally fine. It's actually pretty funny in hindsight. And therefore, a 13-0 Florida State I thought would lock up the number 3 seed because I had Utah, the 4 seed, Big 12 champion, going 12-1. But now, things have changed, obviously. And with Florida State looking the way they did in Ireland against Georgia Tech, I cannot pick them to win the ACC when Miami and Clemson exist. And don't forget about Virginia Tech or Georgia Tech, who's undefeated in ACC and regular season conference play combined. So there are changes that have been made. And consequentially, because Florida State, I not only have them losing to Miami in the regular season, but I also now have them losing to Notre Dame, who I previously picked them to beat on the road in November in what was going to be, in my mind, a close game. Now it could be a Notre Dame blowout. That really messed up the entire bracket. It just, like the hand motions I did, it shuffled everything around. Notre Dame I have at 12-0 for context, and I don't think that they would make the 5 or 6 seed, as I have number 5 Alabama and number 6 Penn State reaching their conference title games with undefeated records and receiving close losses. Both would play, consequentially, by playing in a conference championship game against Ohio State and Georgia, have tougher strength of schedules than Notre Dame would, and with only 1 loss and the same amount of wins, I think they would be seeded ahead of Notre Dame, who now I think is a true cupcake schedule, because I don't think that USC or Florida State or anyone on their schedule except for maybe Georgia Tech, but more likely than Georgia Tech, as I think they're around that USC and Florida State tier. A&M's really their only, I would say, extremely challenging game from a roster and paper standpoint. But college football's played on the field, not on paper. So let me run through this very quickly. I have Liberty still 13-0, Conference USA champions at the 12th seed. I have Iowa 11-1 as the 11th seed, only losing to Ohio State on the road. I have at the 10th seed the Oregon Ducks, losing at home to Ohio State and Michigan on the road. And at 9th, I have the Missouri Tigers, losing only to Alabama on the road, earning key wins, though, against Texas A&M, for example, and Oklahoma. I have at the 8th seed the Michigan Wolverines. Michigan I have going 11-1, beating Texas and Oregon, but losing to Ohio State to close out the season. I have at 7th a 12-0 undefeated Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Their biggest win will be on the road at Texas A&M, and that'll be about it. They beat USC, Florida State, and everyone else on their schedule, but not a very tough strength of schedule, especially compared to number 6 Penn State, who I have going 12-1, beating West Virginia, beating USC, beating Wisconsin, even beating Ohio State at home for the first time since 2016, but losing to the Buckeyes in a rematch in the Big Ten Championship. Therefore, Penn State gets the 6th seed. Ohio State with a 12-1 record, losing to Penn State in the regular season, but beating Oregon, beating Michigan, beating Penn State in the rematch in Indy. They get the 2 seed as they're the Big Ten champions. For the 5 seed, I have the Alabama Crimson Tide. I have them going undefeated in the regular season like Penn State. That means they beat Georgia at home. That means they beat Missouri at home. They will beat LSU and Auburn and Tennessee, Wisconsin on the road. They have a gargantuan schedule. Very hard schedule. I have them at 12-1. Their only loss will come to Georgia in the SEC championship game rematch. Consequentially, Georgia, who I have going 11-1 in the regular season, only losing to Alabama on the road, but beating Texas and Ole Miss on the road. They, with a win over Alabama to earn a 12-1 record and an SEC championship game win, they'll get the number 1 seed, as they will be the SEC champions. At the 4 seed, I have the Utah Utes, who will go 12-1. Their sole loss coming to Iowa State. They'll beat Kansas in the Big 12 championship game and enter as the 4th seed. with a 12-1 record. The 3 seed will be the Miami Hurricanes. I have them going 12-1, losing actually to Georgia Tech in the regular season again, but that's because Georgia Tech is much better than they were last year, and they get a bye before and after the Miami game. So they can go all in and not be afraid of having a letdown game afterward. I think that's a huge advantage for Georgia Tech. And I think Miami, in beating Florida, in beating Florida State, and beating Louisville, Virginia Tech, I think they're bound to mess up somewhere just because there are some holes on their roster. And I don't think that Mario Cristobal, I don't think he's capable of going 12-0. I'll have to see it to believe it with Miami. But I have them going 12-1, winning the ACC championship for now, actually, in a rematch with Georgia Tech. And you'll see why that is in tomorrow's video about my final conference record predictions, post week 0, of course. But at 12-1 ACC champions, I have them ranked number 3 in the college football playoff seeding. So those are the matchups, and I have Michigan beating Missouri. I have Oregon earning a road win over Notre Dame. I have Penn State and Alabama blowing out Iowa and Liberty, respectively. Now let's move on and talk about the semifinals. I have in the quarterfinals Georgia beating Michigan. I think that Michigan and Georgia are similarly built. If Michigan wanted a shot at beating or even dominating Georgia, it was last year when they had a great elite college quarterback and great wide receivers. Now with all of that gone and being a thinner team and Georgia returning as much as they do entering this season, Georgia is Michigan's nightmare matchup. They're not getting past Georgia. Alabama will beat Utah, and consequently the Alabama-Georgia game, I think, will be a semifinal matchup. So they'll meet 3 times in the same season, which will be a record, and it will be, I think, kind of awesome and incredible. There'd be a lot of build-up to that game. Utah would play Alabama more competitively, at least in terms of final score, and I actually think in actuality on the field that Michigan would play Georgia. I think a Kyle Whittingham-type team who's deep in the trenches against an Alabama team who will be a lot of finesse, and they'll be deep in the trenches too, but not as deep as past Saban teams. I think that's a good matchup for Utah. Alabama will overcome all of that, but Utah will play them competitively. I have Oregon beating Ohio State. Ohio State beats them in the regular season. It's hard to beat a good team twice, and I think out of all the Big Ten teams, the top 4 specifically, Oregon, Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State, Oregon, I think, is the best built to play in a playoff setting because of their, I would say, lack of questions at every position except for safety. And if you're going to have questions anywhere, and I don't even think safety's bad for Oregon, I just think it's whether they're average, above average, good, or great there. You'd rather have questions there than at quarterback in the O-line, and that's where Ohio State has their questions. And I think consequentially, from my perspective, Ohio State may actually be the worst built out of those 4 to go into the college football playoff and to reach the national championship. Controversial opinion of mine, I know. And if Ohio State puts together a great offensive line, then that opinion totally falls apart. They'd immediately be the best built because of their wide receivers and the depth and weapons they have basically everywhere else. But I think Oregon, just losing to Ohio State early on, again, it's hard to beat a good team twice. They have the better quarterback, wide receivers, superior offensive line, and they're going to be a very fast team, and they can also slow things down. Ohio State, honestly, first time back, winning the Big Ten. This would be the Rose Bowl matchup, Ohio State versus Oregon, which would give it a kind of classic feel. I just think that Ohio State comes into Outson early in the season, is able to just use that advantage that they have in, I would say, the secondary and the wide receiver core. Ohio State's DBs would be able to limit Oregon's wide receivers. I can't say the same thing about Oregon's wide receivers versus Ohio State's wide receivers, or Oregon's DBs, versus Ohio State's wide receivers. But later in the season, I think that Will Howard, the receivers he has, the limited depth on the offensive line that they have, I think that plus the fact that Oregon, with all the transfers they have on defense, should get better at that spot as the year goes on. And Dylan Gabriel's a really good quarterback. I just think that gives an edge to Oregon there. Another game, which there's a lot of analysis to dive in on, is Penn State versus Miami. And that is because, let's just face it, neither James Franklin or Mario Cristobal are known to be great game managers, but they have great offensive coordinators now. Andy Kotelnicki, I think is the best offensive coordinator in all of college football. And Shannon Dawson could be up there, depending on what Miami does this season. Both have highly talented quarterbacks. Cameron Ward for the Hurricanes, Drew Aller for the Nittany Lions, who have been inconsistent and have their obvious strengths, their obvious potential, but also some very glaring weaknesses. I think both will take big steps forward this year, by the way, but they have questions nonetheless. They're a little bit different at receiver. Penn State is very deep and talented at tight end. Miami's that same way at wide receiver, and they have questions in the other position. Penn State has big questions at wide receiver. Miami has some questions at tight end. They both have deep running back rooms. Damian Martinez, I think, is the best back out of their rooms combined. But then right behind him, you got Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton. And Quinyon Martin is a young player who I think could see some time for Penn State this year. A.J. Allen. And there's another back for Miami who's, I don't like to forget names here, so I'm just going to look. Mark Fletcher Jr. is in there as well with A.J. Allen and Damian Martinez for the Hurricanes. Both have deep, deep running back rooms. Their offensive lines are losing some players each, but Miami should be one of the best of the best. Penn State, with how they've recruited, has that ceiling. I wouldn't project them to be that way now, but certainly I would say a top 15, potentially top 10 offensive line. I'm picking the Nittany Lions to win here because I think that they are, I honestly think that they have the better coordinators. I think they have the better assistant coaches. And James Franklin does get a lot of criticism, and he should. He rightfully does. Same with Mario Cristobal. But I will say that given the fact that I believe Penn State's roster is more NFL ready, and I actually think that James Franklin is a better coach than Mario Cristobal, I think those two things combined, along with the fact that, look, hard schedules will hurt teams a lot because it will wear down on depth. It can earn them extra losses compared to an easy schedule. But an easy schedule does not prepare you for facing the elite teams. Penn State has enough of a balanced schedule to where it's easy outside of their matchup against Ohio State, maybe medium toughness against West Virginia, USC, and Wisconsin, but it's not going to be super challenging on paper. Again, big asterisk there, on paper outside of that Ohio State game, and if they rematch with Ohio State, that second game against Ohio State. They have a little bit of toughness in their schedule, and they'll play a plethora of good defenses like Wisconsin, and they'll play Ohio State, who could have the nation's best defense this season. With Miami, they don't necessarily play that same schedule. It's actually, in my mind, easier than Penn State's. The Big Ten is a different animal than the ACC. That's just a small reason, but a reason nonetheless that I want to mention. Combine that with the fact that I think Penn State has a much better defensive line. They're much better on defense in every position. Defensive line, linebacker, secondary, similar special teams. Offensively, I would say Miami's better, but not to the same degree that Penn State is on defense. And they have the better offensive coordinator. I think that Penn State will slowly but surely, in a game like that, I think that game, I forget if it would be the Peach Bowl. I think it would be the Peach Bowl is what I'm projecting it to be, yes. Penn State would outpace Miami in terms of being able to slow down or speed up the clock, and they'd outcoach them too and move on to the semifinals. The semifinal results, I have Oregon beating Penn State and Georgia beating Alabama. At this point, you can't dive in too deep. I mean, I even struggled to dive in deep for any of these matchups. But the reason I'm picking Georgia to beat Alabama is I think Georgia's the much deeper team. They have the better coaching staff, better head coach. They're the more balanced roster. So I think third time around, these teams both know each other, and therefore I think the best team will win, and that's Georgia. Oregon versus Penn State. I actually think Penn State's the slightly better team than Oregon per my personal power rankings. I wouldn't be surprised if my computerized power rankings, which will be releasing soon, think the same way, but I could easily see them viewing Oregon to be better. But Oregon, I think, how do I put it? It's similar reasons for why they're beating Ohio State. Like, I wouldn't pick Michigan, Penn State. I wouldn't pick anyone in the Big Ten to beat Oregon on a neutral field in a playoff environment. I just wouldn't. And it's especially the case with Penn State over Oregon. I could see Ohio State beating Oregon or Michigan beating Oregon more easily than I could Penn State over Oregon. And the reason for that is Penn State is not strong enough at either wide receiver or the O-line. Michigan and Ohio State both have one of an elite O-line or a near elite O-line or elite, near elite wide receiver room. Penn State's offensive line doesn't have that reputation yet. Their receiving room, I think, is one of the worst ones in the Big Ten, simply because I don't know how healthy Julian Fleming will be. And Oregon's weakness is safety. You need wide receivers and a quarterback who is dynamic. And I would say not just his arm talent, but with how talented Oregon is overall, his legs as well, to make that DB room and that defense overall pay. And I just don't think Penn State, with Aller, who isn't as dynamic of a scrambler as Howard or Orji are, who I think is a worse wide receiver room than both of those teams, a worse O-line than Michigan, a better O-line than Ohio State, but also a worse defense than those teams. And Penn State, like Oregon's already playing several playoff games in a row, so depth begins to show, and I think Oregon is similar depth, probably deeper in terms, definitely deeper in terms of talent. I think at a position like quarterback, more consistent, wide receiver, they're deeper on the offensive line, much more experience there. I think Oregon will pull through. A Georgia versus Oregon game would be fascinating, but I think Georgia is closer to double digits better than everyone this year. As I've said earlier, I think it's Georgia's year to lose the national title. Consequently, it's also their year to win the national title. This is their year to lose. It's also their year to win. I think they're the number one team, and while it's not as distant as, let's say, it was in 2020 with Alabama and everyone else, it's a fairly distant year, I think, in terms of Georgia being at the top compared to everyone else. It'll be similar to Georgia in 2021 and how they were in Tier 1 and everyone else was either in, Tier 1B at the best and then not even in Georgia's room at the very worst. So that is my 2024 college football playoff bracket. Thank you for watching this cut of Touchdown Talk. Remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, comment your thoughts down below, and share this video around to other college football fans. I want to give a special shout out to my Patreon members for sponsoring this channel and video. Thanks to Crash2488 and Braska Rascal for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Connor Little OH, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being all conference members. If you want direct message access to me, and also after 6 months of membership, free signed College Football with Sam merchandise delivered to your door, merchandise of your choosing, I may add, sign up as a Heisman member for $25 a month and stick around for 6 months. All-American membership is $10. All conference membership is $5. If you want merchandise regardless, check out my merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. It's high quality stuff. I wear it for all of my streams, and that's because it's comfortable, high quality, athletic, stretchy. It's really good clothing, and I encourage you to check out my merchandise store along with my Patreon page, which are in the links in the description and in the pinned comment. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.